Hello, this is John Rankin, host of a new television show being broadcast here out of Simsbury, Connecticut, thebibleandpolitics.org. And so if you go to that URL, thebibleandpolitics.org, you will learn about our show, which very simply has two tracks here in Connecticut. Number one is to look at a proposal I have in one of my books called The 6 Pillars of Honest Politics, where I've taken the 17,000 pages of Connecticut law and footnotes as of 2006 when I wrote it and reduced it down to 33. And I think with the political and economic crisis, in my opinion, we face in this state, this is my contribution. So that'll be one track of discussion. The second track is what we're doing in this show on the Bible and politics, any issue where the Bible or politics interfaces from any angle and from every angle. So one of my goals is to have the widest array of willing colleagues and co-hosts to join me with the simple goal of conversation in the face of issues we care about and from as many different angles as possible. So I have 3 guests here today, and I'll let them each introduce themselves. And if I like the introduction, I'll just let it go. If not, I'll just add some flourish to it. So Nick, begin with yourself and introduce who you are.
Certainly. My name is Reverend Nick Mumejian. I am the managing editor of the Muslim World Journal, housed at Hartford Seminary.
And tell us about your educational trajectory in history.
Sure. So I did my undergrad at Liberty University. And after Liberty, I went to...
And how would most people most readily understand what Liberty University is if they didn't know?
Sure. Jerry Falwell, I think, would be the person who they would associate the most with Liberty as the founder and for many years the chancellor. Now his son, Jerry Falwell Jr., is the president, the current president. And so from Liberty University, I found my way to...
So this was the classic home of fundamentalism.
Correct.
50 years ago
the moral
in the United
majority,
States.
yes.
Yeah, the moral majority.
Mm-hmm. And so from there, I found my way to Duke University doing my...
Which is not the moral majority.
It is not. No. It's mainline Protestantism. I found my way there, and I completed my Master of Divinity at Duke. And then a few years after that, I came to Hartford Seminary, and between studies and work, I've been there since 2008.
And we met there.
We did.
Because I was with you in a PhD program,
yes,
which I had to drop out of due to financial and health reasons. And you almost completed it. Now you're switching it over to something in Germany, and I'm working in Oxford on the PhD.
Correct.
But we met, and your study focus, I assume, still is Christian-Muslim relations.
Correct. Yes. My study focus is still Christian-Muslim relations,
which will be delightful to talk about. And just to mention a little bit more about Liberty University and Jerry Falwell. So Jerry Falwell was a classic independent Baptist Southern fundamentalist. And the word fundamentalist is not well understood by a lot of people in the culture. You're familiar, I'm sure, with R.A. Torrey's Fundamentals of the Faith.
Sure.
So what happens is after the advent of Darwinian science and modernism, 1859 on following, those who were evangelical in the proper sense, so Hodges and Warfield at Princeton were the last two that really sort of held up that intellectual approach to the faith. And when they died, the evangelicals did not really have scholarly voices within the mainstream culture. So that's when R.A. Torrey put out the Fundamentals of the Faith, which are straightforward Nicene Creed, a classic faith. But they also retreated from the social arena and basically hid for quite a while until 1948 when Carl F. H. Henry, the founder of Christianity Today, along with Billy Graham, recoined the phrase evangelical. So Jerry Falwell, early 70s, was a fundamentalist, and then he joined the word evangelical. But what happened was he was not aiming to be involved politically. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what brought him into the political world.
Well, I mean, if correct me if I'm wrong, but it happened to be in the early 80s after the Carter administration when he founded the Moral Majority, and that kind of took its
actually it was before that.
Okay.
It was early, I know both his sons, okay?
Okay, well...
So what happens is that
you have to forgive me, I was born in 82.
Oh, okay.
So this is a little before my time.
Yes. I was younger back then.
Okay.
Anyhow, so in the early 70s, he simply wanted to build a Christian school in Lynchburg and got all this grief from the zoning board, okay? That's what got him into politics.
Okay.
So from the word go, he was a reactionary. Now, this is one of my deepest theological concerns, is to react or respond to something is appropriate, but do we respond on a prior positive basis or just reaction to reaction and we all drown in the same miserable soup? And obviously he had a prior proactive understanding of the gospel, but still, when you get into the political world, you see a lot of reactions feeding off reactions. That led to the moral majority and all the people who protested. Are you saying we're part of the immoral minority? So that's the meta-ethics of language. How do people understand what we mean by what we say? So this is where you did your undergraduate work, and then you went to Duke University with its Methodist history.
Correct.
And a lot of wonderful scholars whom I studied when I was at Harvard. Howard Voss and Yoder wasn't there, but John Howard Yoder studied him as well, and some of their colleagues. Willimon, a couple others.
Richard Hayes.
Yes.
Amy Lowell Hall.
Yeah, Amy, I think, was a little bit younger from when I was studying.
Okay.
So anyhow, so what happens is you started in a fundamentalist world, which has its political baggage. You go into a world that's not fundamentalist, and the politics are far more eclectic.
Yes.
And then Hartford Seminary, even more eclectic. So as we go through our storyline, it'll be delightful to see a perspective with the audience understanding that this is your wonderful background. And I say wonderful as an evangelical myself, because an evangelical is a word from the Greek euangelion that means the good news. And so when many people react to evangelical, think of it in a socio-cultural dynamic, like we just profiled a little bit, or doctrinal rigidities, or sexual ethos, standards and whatnot, when indeed none of that is applicable unless we know first what the good news is. And then also, I always ask myself, when people meet me as an evangelical, do they see someone who is good newsy in my character, in the way I treat people, which is really the gospel, loving God and loving neighbor. So, Christina.
My name is Christina Bennett. I am from Connecticut. I grew up here. Went to college at Southern Connecticut State in New Haven. I ended up leaving college, after I was finished, and just going in a different direction than I thought I was going to go into. I thought I was going to go into maybe writing or journalism, but I ended up actually going back home and starting a Bible club, but then going into ministry, particularly pro-life ministry. And so in 2005, I ended up going to Washington, D.C., and I lived there for 3 years. I was a part of a pro-life prayer ministry called the Justice House of Prayer and Bound for Life DC. And then after that, I moved to Atlanta, Georgia, and I was a part of another prayer ministry called the International House of Prayer Atlanta and Bound for Life Atlanta, which was also a pro-life organization. So from about 2005 to 2012, I did full-time pro-life work, full-time ministry. I also did some short-term missions trips, like I spent 3 months in Mozambique, and I went to Nepal and Italy and Holland and Guatemala and other places. And then 2012, I came back home to Connecticut. I ended up working for a pregnancy resource center for 4 years, the ABC Women's Center, which is still active in Milltown, Connecticut. I ended up getting married, and now I work as the communications director for the Family Institute of Connecticut in Hartford.
Now, your testimony of how you got born.
I got born. Well, I got born the normal way.
I'm probing.
No. Well, what ended up causing me to go into pro-life work, I did not grow up in a family where we talked about abortion, and I actually, even though I had grown up and going to different churches, when my parents, were divorced, so I went with my dad to Asylum Avenue Baptist Church in Hartford, and my mom, I think we were in Assemblies of God Church for a while, and my mom grew up Catholic, so I was all over the place in different churches, but I had never heard anyone talk about abortion in church, and I definitely hadn't heard about it in my family, and I think I had heard about it, of course, in school, but not from a pro-life perspective, just from a perspective of, pro-choice perspective. And when I was in college, I was attending a church, and someone had approached me and said that something remarkable had happened around the time of my birth, and I'd asked my mother what that was, and she said to me that she met an angel before I was born, which was really interesting. She'd never said anything like that, before or after. And she also didn't want to talk about it. That's the only thing she wanted to say. She didn't want to say anything else. And so I left it alone. At that time in college, I was a part of a campus ministry called Campus Crusade for Christ, which you might be familiar with. And I went away to Kentucky to do a summer inner city ministry trip. And during that summer, I was just determined that I would get back home and find out what my mom was talking about, because it was really eating away at me. I was very curious. And so I came back home from Kentucky after that summer trip was over, and I asked her, and she said, I can't tell you because you'd hate me. And she was very hesitant to tell me, and I really kind of, not begged her, but I pleaded a little bit with her, tell me what you're about. I would never hate you. And finally she admitted that she had scheduled to abort me. And that's when she had this encounter, which she believes was an angel, and only God knows, it doesn't really matter ultimately, but she had scheduled to abort me at Mount Sinai Hospital in Hartford, Connecticut, and this is in 1981, so this is a time when they were doing abortions. Now they've merged to St. Francis, but at the time they were doing a number of abortions, and she was pressured by my dad to have an abortion. He already had 2 kids at the time and didn't want any more. And she went by herself, and she got counseling, but really there was no counsel. The woman just said, this seems like the best decision for you to make, and took her money. My mom ended up sitting in the hallway between the counselor's office and the waiting room where she was supposed to go next. And in that time period, she just put her head down, gently was crying, not making a scene, and there was a elderly African-American janitor on the other end of the hallway who walked up to her, lifted up her chin, looked her in the eyes, and said, do you want to have this baby? Now, my mom believes that this woman was an angel because she said her eyes were like pools of water. When my mom responded yes, that she wanted to have her baby, this woman said, God is going to give you the strength to have your child, and she told her to go put her clothes back on and leave. My mom said it was a pretty long hallway. She put her head down for a couple of seconds. She put her head back up, and she would have estimated that this woman would have been midway through the hallway because her age and the fact that she had this bucket and everything. And my mom said it was a long hallway, and she was gone, and that surprised her a little bit. But she walked into the doctor's office. Actually, she walked into the waiting room, and then the doctor called her name into his office, and he hadn't cleaned up the blood from the last abortion, which was really shocking to her. So when she came into his office, she said, I'm leaving, I've changed my mind, I want to have my baby. And he said, no. He said, you've already paid for this, and you're just nervous, you're going to go through with it. And she said, no, again, I've changed my mind, I want to have my baby. And he yelled at her, he screamed, don't leave this room, which my mom now feels like was because he didn't want to lose money, and he didn't want other women to walk out as well. So she was really firm, and she said no, and she ran out, and then she didn't tell anybody. She didn't tell me, obviously, until I was in my 20s, and she was very hesitant to tell me that day. But when she did tell me, that's when everything began to change for me. I had no desire to ever do any sort of pro-life work, or I didn't even think I knew that was a thing you could do for your life. But God began to speak to my heart about me being wanted, and then he asked me the question of, how do you think I feel about the others? And so then I had to figure that out, and then I connected with you, and that began my pro-life journey.
And it's a remarkable testimony, because here we are sitting in this TV show, the 4 of us, and we're looking at a young woman. And by the way, you are very, very young, okay?
Well, I'm 37, but
as I said.
I'll take that, though. Thank you. I look younger than that.
In the range of my children. And my children are young because I'm their father. They have to be young. So anyhow, but it is remarkable to sit and to look at you with your entire personality. I'm looking in your eyes.
Yep.
And Jesus said the eyes are the windows of the souls. They are. So much communication is whether or not someone's free to give you their eyes.
Yeah.
Okay? Freedom versus hiddenness, or pain is usually the reason for the hiddenness. And yet, boom, that close, and you wouldn't be here. I lost a granddaughter 5 years ago.
Wow.
And I don't want to get into details because it was medical malpractice that led to it. I'll just leave it right there. But so for me, my oldest 2 sons, and my wife, and my brother, and my daughter, I don't think my youngest son was in the area at the time, to hold little Ellie, at 13 ounces, born at 20 weeks.
Wow.
See, she should have been under neonatal intensive care, which she wasn't. Otherwise, she would have done fantastically. Healthy, strong. And by the way, she's part African American.
Wow.
Okay, she's African, Portuguese, and all my Scottish
And
stuff.
I am Portuguese too.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, anyhow,
That in
so,
common.
so what happens is that this beautiful young woman, her hair was just shock black, and you could see the strength, the personality, the vigor, you know. So she could not, her lungs didn't function, and she lived for almost 2 hours.
Wow.
That was the will to live, the vitality that was there. And so for myself, you know, I composed a poem thereafter about, you know, one day I will run with her in the fields of heaven with her hair flowing in the wind. And that brings us to the deeper theology of what is a political evil and questions of good and evil. But so here we're talking eyeball to eyeball, you know. And I was there when you brought your testimony up to Senator Richard Blumenthal at Wesley University, and he wasn't pleased to hear your testimony.
Yeah, I know.
He wanted to change the subject. So,
Yeah.
But I think it's a marvelous testimony because it's entirely humanizing. And in one theological point I will make, in all my work in Genesis on following, are the assumptions of what it is to be in the image of God, made by God, and the definitions of good and evil, life and death, freedom and slavery that you find in Genesis 2. And to sum up good and evil very simply is this: good humanizes and evil dehumanizes.
Yes, totally.
From the slightest element, where we just, you know, treat someone offhandedly or not with respect, to the greatest elements. Josh, throw in your 2 cents or $30 worth.
Yeah, so I thought it was so cool what you shared, because I just saw the contrast between light and dark from the janitorial individual to the doctor, and how when there's a level playing field, light always wins out. And that's what I saw in there. And I thought it was so neat that here's a person that came to your mom that is whether they were an angel or a person that was just a kind person wanting to share their heart. Jesus came as a foot washer, and this person came as a janitor to share with your mom. And here's a doctor. You see the higher level that society looks at. But then when we look at through God's eyes, we see something different. And when there's a level playing field and you hear both sides, that's all a lot of people are asking is for that level playing field, to hear both sides and then let people decide.
And so that terms can be defined honestly and cross-examined so that an informed choice can happen.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's very important.
Pretty cool.
You know, Christina, you mentioned the angel thing, and anyone who reads the Bible, the angels are everywhere, okay?
Everywhere, yes.
Because the assumption is that there isn't a bifurcation between the physical world and the spiritual world. It's all one. But I'll just tell you a brief story. I haven't thought about this in quite a while. Just before I came to seminary, I was a manager of a retail store outside Pittsburgh. And there was this guy who had always come in, and he just was not a regular guy. And I never saw him talk to anyone except to this woman who I knew was a deeply committed Catholic charismatic Christian, okay? And he would talk to me, and every time he would talk to me, he would do it with such love and such interest, and yet I felt he was watching me and holding me accountable in some sense. And so the last day of my job, and before Nancy and I headed out to Boston for seminary, I stepped outside, and he was sitting there with a bunch of children, maybe 12 or 14, and I thought, oh, I didn't even know his name. I said, what are you doing here? He said, oh, I'm taking care of my children. And they were of all racial backgrounds, and they were getting on a bus to go to see a Pittsburgh Pirates game. This is 1978. And so I thought about that. I walked 2 steps, turned around, he was gone. And there was no way I could see.
Wow.
He could have walked, like this woman walked down the hallway, you know? So I don't know the answer to that, but I've thought about that a lot, taking care of my children, when you have also in the Bible God appearing as an angel and so forth, you know, say with Abraham.
Well, you know, supernatural things do happen.
Yeah, one of the things that you also mentioned was your dad was trying to pressure her. And I know a lot of times when we talk about that, the overriding pressure from the abortion lobbyists is a chauvinistic, it comes from a chauvinistic viewpoint. And I know John has talked about that in the past, and I think that that's one thing that we don't always talk about. You know, a woman says, it's my body, I have the right to choose, but there's a lot of times there's a man behind that trying to push that agenda forward.
Oh, often. I mean, we just saw that case in the news just this week with that poor girl who was a cheerleader who got killed by her boyfriend. And he said the reason that or her ex-boyfriend, I don't know what he would call himself, but he said the reason that he killed her was because she waited too long to tell him that she was pregnant, so he couldn't get her to have an abortion. They're in high school. She was a cheerleader. He was a football player. And the police questioned him, and he said, well, she waited so long. She didn't tell me she was pregnant. I think she was 6 months pregnant when he killed her. And so he said, I had to take action. I had to take action myself, which for him meant taking a knife and stabbing her in the heart, throwing her body in the river. And I don't know why he thought that would be a better option than him being a parent. I mean, or even if he was a distant parent, that would have been a better option than him doing this to this poor girl. But you have to wonder what in his mind would make him think that he could dispose of this woman. Well, he knows society says that he could dispose of a child, but that option was taken away from him. And so then he took matters into his own hands. And so it's really scary. And thankfully for my father, my mom, when she did leave and she called him, they tried to make it work. They got married, and their marriage didn't last. It only lasted a year, but my dad has still always been a part of my life and very supportive of me. My mom's very supportive. I couldn't tell my story unless my dad and my mom both felt comfortable with me talking about it. And so, it's important, I think, to speak to men, because so often they are that voice behind the woman telling her what to do, or I'm going to leave you, or I'm going to, go get another girlfriend if you don't have this abortion. But at the same time, to remember that in a sense, they're victims as well to the lies that society has told them. One of those lies being, you don't have this say. And, so sometimes they're pressuring, but sometimes there are men that want to keep their baby, and they have been told by society the best thing that you can do is just tell a woman that it's her body and her choice and just let her do what she wants to do. And so we're all in a difficult place because of abortion.
And that psychology takes over after decades of this.
Yeah.
Of course, you've worked with a crisis pregnancy center.
I did, yeah.
Resource
I did for
center.
4 years. And I still speak at a lot of events for them.
I've spoken at a number over the years, particularly in the 80s and 90s. And I know women who have personally counseled, in a couple of cases, 30,000 women.
Wow.
One-on-one over the years.
That's a lot.
Well, this one friend of mine in California has been doing this since the 1970s.
Wow.
Okay. And one woman, a counselor I ran into years ago, she said, John, the woman always does what the man says to do. And so if you think about that in terms of the language of pro-choice, pro-informed choice and freedom, so I think it's right to hold men accountable, which is a very large issue. Let's shift gears a little bit here. So there we've touched a little bit on the politics, but what we've done here, and in our first show, I was really delighted, four of his colleagues, including Josh, was we were talking about the idea of the Bible and politics. And politics, most people think of issues.
Yep.
Okay.
Sure.
And I pointed out that that's a Greek way of thinking. Do you know Greek, Nick?
I do.
You do. Okay. So the whole, and of course, in Greek we've got the dualistic thinking, the Platonic thinking of the ideal. You see this in Greek art and architecture versus the accident or the real stuff of life. Well, Hebrew doesn't focus on the ideal, focus on the real stuff of life. There's a real balance between the two. So Hebrew politics is all based on relationships or the pursuit of shalom. Shalom, most people understand as the word for peace.
Yeah.
Deeper than that, it's a word for wholeness and integrity, body relationships. In Greek, you are a member of the city-state, but the city-state is where the identity is, not in you as a person, okay? So what happens is that politics, and the word polis, from the Greek word for city-state, a lot of people, politics is just contest of ideas.
Yeah.
And people can get dehumanized so very easily. So in our first show, I was pleased among the four of us who were there that we moved very quickly away from ideas to relationships.
I love that.
And that's what we're doing here again. And I think that that's what I will always be doing because that's my wiring. So Nick, let's shift to you. So you've been through a theological and political contextual shift in your life in terms of location. I have no idea what you believe about a lot of this stuff. I just think you're a great guy.
Thank you.
And I'm also interested in learning your thoughts on here on politics, theology, and then the work you're doing through the publication of the Muslim World.
Sure. So I'll go a little deeper into how I ended up at Liberty. I didn't take my faith into Christianity seriously until going into my senior year of high school. My mother was Roman Catholic. My mother was charismatic. My father was Roman Catholic. Okay. And my parents were divorced, and I would split time between them. And Yeah, so it was one Sunday was Catholicism, the other Sunday charismatic Christianity. And in high school, I began to go to a non-denominational church. And as I began to take my faith seriously, I felt that I needed to go to a Christian school. I had no idea who Jerry Falwell was at the time. I didn't even know much about Liberty University, but I had a pastor tell me that you should apply to Liberty. It's accredited. It's in Virginia, a state that I wanted to stay in. And I found my way there, and I applied, and I ended
So what
up,
year is this that you started?
this is 2000.
2000, okay.
I applied. I got a very generous scholarship, and in comparison with some of the other schools I had applied to that weren't Christian, the scholarship was too much to turn down. I mean, I didn't want to go into debt. However, while I was at Liberty, the events of 9/11 happened a year later, and that's where I began to have a shift in my own personal beliefs and feelings, because I began to hear a lot of disparaging things about Muslims after 9/11. I can understand the anger, I can understand the heartache, but it was really troubling to me to hear people who professed Christ as their Lord saying quite horrible things about Muslims. I had one professor who spoke about dipping bullets in pig's blood as we...
I may know who that is, but go ahead.
Yeah, spoke about dipping bullets in pig's blood. And I thought to myself, how is this Christ-like? I mean, we're supposed to be at the evangelical university in the U.S. So it was there that I began to read, as you mentioned earlier, folks like Hauerwas, another person like
And
Richard
let me
Hayes.
just stop
Yes.
there for a second, make an observation.
Sure.
And this is crucial. And I've done so many forums with atheists, and the departure point for them is never intellectual or theological, it's all ethical. They see hypocrisy in the church, they see broken trust in their families. In other words, we're all wired in the image of God for trust. If we don't have trust, we have nothing. And
Sure.
so there, you're raised as a Christian, and you see those professing Christ, who, it's not just a question disagreeing with Islam, it's hating the person, which is the opposite of the Sermon on the Mount.
Sure. I mean, even George Lindbeck in his great book, Nature of Doctrine, says, the crusader who says Christ is Lord, but slays the infidel with the sword, that statement is incorrect as they say it.
And George Lindbeck, at the head of the Narrative School of Theology at Yale, along with Breber's Child and one other, and Ron Thiemann.
Hans Frey.
Yeah, Hans Frey.
Yeah.
Yes, I've read all of them. And Ron Thiemann was dean of Harvard Divinity School when I was a student there. Okay. So that's how I met Ron. And I remember that, so I have I'm an ordained minister as well. I graduated from Gordon Conwell, which I think is the theological evangelical epicenter of the world, but that's a different issue. Because their intellectual work in the Hebrew Bible is so good. I'm so grateful for that. But anyhow, so there I was, an evangelical down at Harvard. I said down because I lived up on the North Shore. And Ron Thiemann has this one class a year, the only class he teaches as dean, and it's theology and politics. And there are 12 spots. And there were 88 applicants, and I got in. I was doing full-time pro-life work then. Also, I already had an MDiv degree under my belt. And I was so intimidated in that class, how smart and how organized he was. I thought, I'm going to fail this big time. But he responded to me so well, and he couldn't believe how I talked about the level playing field of listening to the people disagree with you, and he says, we need evangelicals like this. But he's the one who introduced me to the Narrative School of Theology. Sure. And the Narrative School of Theology was challenging, and you can perhaps go into this as well, challenging the simplicity that the Bible or Christian faith is simply doctrines or principles. It's a storyline. It's a storyline full of humanity. And unless we have that understanding of how the Bible presents a storyline, we're in bad shape. So I don't know if this is what happened with you and the one professor you mentioned, but my experience otherwise is the doctrine overtakes the humanity of the storyline.
Yeah, for me, I'm Armenian.
Okay.
I have family born in the Middle East. I had family members who were Muslim being married in. And so I knew Muslims not just as neighbors or as friends, but as family members. And so to hear the disparaging things and these very disparaging things by these quote-unquote evangelical leaders at the time, I just couldn't believe it. You're talking about my family, and not only that, again, you're professing to be a Christian, a follower of Christ, but yet this is what's coming out of your mouth. And so it created a bad taste in my mouth, lack of a better term. And so I found my way to Duke, and studying with professors who their ethics, I thought, was far more Christ-centered than those who were at Liberty. And it was while I was at Duke that I began to engage and begin my Christian-Muslim my longing and my desire to do Christian-Muslim relations.
And what you're also describing for people who don't understand is you went from one school, Liberty University, that could be described as militaristic in its politics.
Sure.
To perhaps the theological pacifist center of the country.
Sure. Fair enough. No, it's very fair enough.
Yeah. And what happens is, and what I love about, so John Howard Yoder, okay, in his Politics of Jesus, and I think he gets it wrong at many points, okay? But putting that, and I heard him speak but putting that aside, he, in one of his writings, said that when Constantine legalized the church in the early 4th century, to protect the church from persecution, good.
Yeah.
But then he used state power to enforce doctrine upon the church, and therefore was taking a political authority over the church. And though Constantine gave religious political freedom to Jews and pagans, skip 1.5 generations, and Theodosius is persecuting them. And baptism was adult baptism 99% of the time until Constantine. Then it became infant baptism because that was the same as Roman citizenship. So what happens is John Howard Yoder said point blank, the church died with the outflow of Constantine. So though I'm not a pacifist, I think there are problems with it. I believe in the Prince of Peace, you know, but that's a deeper issue. The point is, I think that Yoder was mark on, and unless we come to a point of when we are looking at people who disagree with us theologically, politically, and honor their humanity and see what motivates them and what drives them. And that's why it's just good to begin to unpack your story a little bit, stuff I didn't know.
Sure.
And it makes perfect sense from knowing you as a person.
I would add two things real quick. One, in light of what has come to our attention about John Howard Yoder and his abhorrent sexual misconducts with students, just absolutely abhorrent. I mean, we should condemn him for what that was. I just, first and foremost, want to say that
that's also the opposite of pacifism in the personal level.
And then the second thing would be with pacifism, it's not just pacifism, it's a Christological pacifism. It's not pacifism just for the sake of pacifism. It's a pacifism because Jesus Christ himself was a pacifist in his actions and his attitudes and his own taking up of the cross. So it's not a pacifism in and of itself. It's a Christological pacifism.
Theologically full of good thought.
Sure.
The question is that when he returns with a sword, but that's a different issue.
When does he return with the sword?
In the second coming.
Okay, and is the sword not the two-edged, right?
Yeah.
Just like it's just not if it's spoken about in the book of Hebrews, maybe a Bible, but.
Well, but that's a larger issue, but it's also dripping with blood. But
the slain lamb is the one that holds the key to the book of life.
But see, this is the fun discussion. This is really good. And the point is that unless we respect people who have integrity from different perspectives, because we might have different perspectives, but yet we ultimately going to find united humanity. And it can be risk-taking in doing that. Now, Josh has got something to ask, but I'm going to have him hold on a second while I ask you one question. I'm going to take the prerogative. So, okay, now there's so much territory here. But so when you see the dehumanization of fellow image bearers of God, Muslim people, okay, in post 9/11, and yet you've got different theological issues, debates that are real, different political histories that are real. I'll just make one observation, congruent with the pacifism. The first 3 centuries of the Christian church was suffering, okay? Well, the moment that Islam comes out of the gate, it's the sword, against its enemies. So there's a great difference. So with that in the background, okay, what is your best instinct for how we as Christians should behave politically to the political reality of Islam, say, in the Middle East on outward?
So, okay, that's quite a large...
I try to make it simple.
Well, quite a large question. Obviously, so the early years of Islam, we're talking about a context in which we have tribes living in a desert, and so it's very tribal. And so this idea of that there's the sword being used that's just the context of what's happening during that time in the Arabian Peninsula. It's very tribal. So it's not that they just said, hey, out of nowhere, let's be violent and take up the sword. This is just what they were used to doing.
This is the culture into which they're born and raised.
Today's political current climate, for a Christian, again, I mean, I take Christ's words, love your neighbor as yourself, love your enemy. You know, Paul in Romans 12 says, you know, do not repay evil with evil.
Right.
If your enemy is hungry, give them something to eat. If your enemy is thirsty, give them something to drink. I take this very seriously. So whether you consider Muslims as your neighbor, as I do, I think Muslims are my neighbor, or you consider them your enemy, the mandate, whether you're reading the red letters or whether you're reading Paul, is clearly simple. It's to love them.
And my simple perspective on that is that anyone who's a Christian today has no human enemies.
Okay.
The only enemies we have
Fair
are
enough.
Satan and his demons.
Okay.
And so when you look at enemy status in the Hebrew Bible, it is the gods of the nations against the messianic lineage and the demons behind them, as the Apostle Paul would point out.
Sure.
That's a far larger discussion. But see, what's so important here is that there are so many textures.
Sure.
And the only, or I'd say the interpretive interest I have is a humanity under regardless. I agree with everything you said about Paul because I think he's a good source in terms of loving our neighbors. It's hard to love our neighbors in the face of political conflict and national conflict. So anyhow, so then you go from Liberty to Duke, and then I didn't know about, well, I mean, your last name, but your Armenian background. And so that's a very natural fit for you as you edit the Muslim world. So tell us a little bit.
To an extent. So I mean, I'm Armenian, but if anyone knows the history of Armenians and Turks, they would understand that there would be perhaps a natural inclination to not want to engage in Muslims because of what happened in 1915 with the Armenian genocide.
Yeah.
And I think that even more so, it was important for me to want to engage in Christian-Muslim relations and try, and again, following the mandate of Christ to love our neighbors and to even those. I like what you're saying about there are no enemies, but even when we consider folks our enemies, to love them and to engage
what
them.
I mean is I consider no one my enemies.
Sure.
They may consider them my enemies.
Yeah.
But that's their problem, not mine.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's why the Bible says, "Be wise as a serpent, but gentle as a dove."
Sure.
Because we're not supposed to be foolish either, you know. So we can recognize that there are people out there that really don't like you, regardless of how nice you are or what you say. Yeah, they will.
But I think by and large,
hurt you.
it's mostly, forgive me, evangelical Christians who don't like the Muslims more so than vice versa. If we're talking in generalizations here, the majority of the Muslims I meet, they are very kind and very welcoming and very happy to engage.
And of course, they have more cultural identity of the hospitality ethic than the diaspora of different Christian denominations in this country. So is part of your observation from Southern fundamentalist Christianity in terms of Christian inhospitality? Yeah, and regardless, see, unless we can look candidly at our own deficits and our upbringing or the choices we've made, then we can't learn from others.
Sure.
And we can learn from everyone. And if people think they can't learn from everyone, then I say that what's his name with Balaam and his donkey, you know, he had to learn from a donkey speaking. So unfortunately he didn't, but God had to use a donkey at that point. Josh, were you going to follow through more with some things that Nick
I was going to ask
put
you
on
a
the table?
question, but just to circle back around, some of the challenges that people have, I used to live in Texas, and some of the challenges that they have is the genocide throughout the world of Christians.
Okay.
And so when they see that on TV all the time, I think last year there was 94,000 Christians that were martyred, and 107,000 the year before, somewhere around there. So when you see that all the time, that becomes a challenge for people. But if you're reading the scriptures, you still have to love your enemy.
Sure.
And you still, but you don't have, I'm not going to go to the Middle East where they're chopping Christians' heads off and say, hey, I'm a Christian.
Yeah.
That's the part that you don't want to be foolish either, because there's certain groups that are actually committing those atrocities throughout the world right now.
Certainly.
And so, so it's not right, but there's another side to that where you can understand why people might have those feelings of frustration towards a group. I had a friend for a very long time that was a Muslim, and I spent a lot of time with him. It was, as a matter of fact, he was my assistant manager at a company during 9/11, we watched it on TV together. It gave me an opportunity to discuss these things with him. And he had a hard time with Christianity. But Christianity to him was Catholicism.
Okay.
And so as we spent time discussing, he said, if I was to be a Christian, I'd be more like you because you understand and you're open and you're wanting to hear the other side, and there's a difference there. But the question I had for you was, I think is important, because I think a lot of, if there are people watching today, might be families that are broken families. And you said that you went to your mom and then you went to your dad's, and there was the Catholicism and the charismatic. And so you have a perspective that probably a lot of kids today are going through. Or as a parent, how could you speak to some parents that might say, how do you handle that as a Christian and not get too confused, or how do you address something like that? Because I think that might be important for some people to...
Sure. Okay, so let me address one quick thing that you had mentioned before. With regards to the unfortunate killing of 85,000 Christians. I mean, the Iraq War killed hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians that were Muslim. Hundreds of thousands. Right now in Yemen, we have, 85,000 children starving. And you have a U.S.-backed coalition of Saudi Arabia with this. I mean, and it's unfortunate. All this death is unfortunate, but it's not. This is what happens is when you start. Well, they killed 85,000 Christians, so therefore we have to look at all of the bigger picture here. I mean, any death of anyone, of any image bearer of God, any child of God, is horrific. And so I think this is why. What I'm trying to do with Christian-Muslim relations is important, because it breaks my heart that you have perhaps the greatest famine in 100,000, I'm sorry, in the last 100 years, close to 100,000 children in Yemen. And then you have these innocent civilians in Iraq that we can argue about. Another show could be about whether the first Iraq War and the second Iraq War were truly, forget pacifism, but just wars, and what happened with them. So I just wanted to say I don't like this idea of like, okay, 85,000 died on our side. We shouldn't have these numbers back and forth. We're all children of God. We're all image bearers, and I think there needs to be understanding that death is happening, and it's larger than just Christian Muslim. There is a political aspect of it, and truth needs to be spoken to power about what's happening with what happened in Iraq, with what's happening right now in Yemen. The powers and principalities that Paul talks about. Yep. I think it's greater than just demons lurking in the halls. It's the powers of greed. It's the powers of corruption. And of military industrial complex.
Paul, actually, if you look in Ephesians 6, he defines 5 levels of demonic power in a military hierarchy, okay, including the cosmos kraturus, which are the demons over political power, okay? And then when you look at all the demonic power that Jesus identifies throughout the Hebrew Bible, they're all behind the political powers that are trying to kill the Messiah's line. But what's so interesting here is that, yes, we could unpack so much of the real texture that is there. But when a person only looks at it at an either-or capacity, and you're bringing this to bear, then the warfare attitude toward another is so easy to rise. But when you walk in another person's shoes and you listen to them and listen to their story, which once again is a storyline. So that's part of my goal here, is to unpack this. But by golly, every time you've raised an issue, there's been 30 others that I'm interested in. Okay?
Well, so
and that's good.
And I appreciate you trying to this idea of the level playing field, the level, hearing the other side. And I think it's really important. One of the things that I first learned in seminary was this idea of being charitable towards the other. So whomever the other may be, you need to be charitable towards them, understanding why it is that they believe with the vantage point that you disagree with. We can even take the not to get back into this, but the idea of the pro-life movement.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think about that a lot.
We talk about there's many women. There's not a man involved, and that may be why they're contemplating this. What is the socioeconomic aspects that's driving them towards this decision? This idea of pro-choice when there really isn't a choice. I mean, if the church was to really stand up and help these women who are in need financially, whatever the case may be, I mean, that would offer them a choice. But many times these women feel, and look, I'm a white male, I'm one of the last ones to be talking about this, but from my understanding,
I think you're the first one who should be talking about it, in my opinion. But
we all have, I mean.
I was going to say, let me just finish my point. I think that there are circumstances beyond what I will be able to grasp that I need to be charitable towards and understanding what it is that's driving them to consider such a very life-altering decision. And I think it goes beyond just some, there are cases when maybe a male is pushing them, but I think there are times when I don't have money, I don't have support, I don't have a man one way or another. They're just different things. These are complex issues.
Well, Christina, could you, since you worked in the Pregnancy Resource Center, you could give a little flavor of what they do nationwide and have done for 40 years.
Sure. So I was going to say that. So there are actually thousands of pregnancy resource centers across the country that help women not just during their pregnancy but even after. So these are safe places that women can go to, and they can get free pregnancy tests, free ultrasounds, and then they have parenting classes for during their pregnancy, and then 2 years afterwards. They give them material resources. The one that I worked for, we were doing baby showers with women. We were connecting them to local resources. We worked with domestic violence shelters. We worked with homeless shelters, women's homes. We worked with WIC and SNAP. And
a lot of churches.
And a lot of churches
They're
to
really
support
integrating them into,
Yeah, so it wouldn't just be during their pregnancy, but afterwards. And I think to your point that we absolutely do need to come from a place of understanding. Absolutely. We have to come from a place of not judging women and hearing their heart and knowing what the circumstances are. And they're very different for every single person. Yes, there are some women who it's because a guy's pressuring them. And there's other women who they just feel like, I can't go to school, I can't finish college, or I can't have another baby. I mean, there's married women who have abortions because they think, I just had a baby with my husband, I can't afford to have another baby. So it's very important to understand them so that you're not putting yourself above them and coming off as, I got everything figured out and you don't, and that's why you're doing this. But at the same time, there's a difference between understanding something and accepting it, and also understanding something and there's a difference between that and believing something is good for a woman, because I believe that abortion is not a solution that's good for a woman because of the physical complications, the emotional complications. Now, of course, I've met many women who told me, I met a woman who said, I've had 6 abortions and it didn't bother me at all. And she said it just like that. And whether or not that's really true or not, only God knows, because she may be just overcompensating and maybe hasn't processed that pain. But when you actually dig deep into women's stories with abortions and you see the way that it can hurt them, you see how women will 20 years later come up to me and they'll have tears in their eyes and say, yeah, I had an abortion 20 years before and I can still remember it. Some of them who can't run a vacuum or can't go to the dentist because they're triggered by the sound. And this is something that there's really no place for them in society to talk about, because society says, no, abortion is women's liberation, abortion is freedom. And so I just saw over Facebook, it was circulating, it kind of went viral. There was a woman who had an abortion, she was a young girl, and she did a post saying goodbye to her baby. She showed the ultrasound and she said, I just want to say goodbye. I couldn't have you right now. And people just flipped out on both sides, and people were really angry that she would post it, something so personal, and people were judging her. And she got really defensive back, and she said, I've had another abortion and I had this one, and she was kind of snarky, and she said, I had them for free, and people were like, oh, that's because of the taxpayers, and she said, people are asking me if they could adopt the next baby if I ever have one. She goes, I wouldn't give my baby to any of you. And so it became this really angry conversation. But what I noticed about it was that I think the reason that people responded in that way is because people aren't used to people grieving publicly in that way. It's either abortion is wrong and so therefore I don't have one, or abortion is good and therefore I have positive things to say about it. But here's a woman who's saying abortion I think was the right decision for me, but I have some sorrow over it and I'm sharing my sorrow. And so it's just this messy thing and people didn't know how to respond to it. And so it's always important to have compassion. I know when I was in Africa, I remember just going to the beach and seeing all these little kids run to the water. And these little kids are poor, and they've got these, they don't have bathing suits like we have bathing suits when we go to the beach. They had like little tattered shorts and everything. And I would go into villages and I'd see them with their little bloated bellies, and you look at all of them and they're so beautiful, but they're struggling with so many things, and you feel so overwhelmed because you ask yourself, what can I do to help these children? What is the answer? But in your heart, the answer is never for them to have not existed, or the answer is never for them to take their lives. And I think that abortion can never be a solution to poverty. It can never be a solution to women's desperate situations, because the number one reason that women have abortions is financial, which shows you that, especially in the Black community, no little girl dreams of having an abortion. No little girl says, I hope one day when I turn 25 years old that I can have an unplanned pregnancy and have an abortion. So why is she having the abortion? Because she doesn't have her needs met. But instead, we think that the grand thing is to offer her abortion. And that's I've offered you an abortion. Like, wow, I'm really wonderful. Like, politicians take pictures and they say, I support women's rights. I've offered her an abortion. You've offered her like the lowest thing, because she's having an abortion because she doesn't have resources. She's having an abortion because she doesn't have a home. And so, yes, well, what do we do in the meantime? Some people would say, well, just let her have the abortion because, how can we fix all these different things at once? And, that's where it gets complicated. But what I found is that, yes, the church definitely, we need to step up. We need to do more. We're doing more than people understand and more than people talk. You never hear on the nightly news about the ways in which the church is helping pregnant women and families. I mean, you're not going to hear those stories. And even when you talk about abortion in terms of evangelicals and you talk about it, you're only going to hear it from a political standpoint. You're only going to hear these evangelicals are going and they're fighting abortion at the Supreme Court, or they're fighting abortion in politics. You're not going to hear about the things that I see when I travel all across the country and I'm talking to women of color, and I'm seeing how people are letting them live in their homes and they're giving them resources and they're helping pay their rent, and these are the stories you're not hearing. But again, there's poverty and all of these ills of the world. The answer to those things is not destroying the child. I mean, I myself was born to a woman who was low income, who had I think that's why the counselor probably looked at her and was like, seems like the best decision for you to make. In fact, Oprah, and I'll just end at this, but it's interesting. So Oprah, I don't know if you saw this in the news. So Oprah's mom just passed away over Thanksgiving. And so People magazine is reporting how this week, you can Google it, Oprah's last words to her mother. And it's very interesting, but Oprah's last words to her mother was thanking her, and we would say as pro-lifers for choosing life, but what she actually said was, Mom, you had me when you were 17 years old, and she literally said, you could have chosen to abort me, you could have chosen to place me for adoption, but you didn't, and I just want to thank you, and I think that turned out well. I turned out well, and it's Oprah. And so, a lot of people are not able to accept the beauty of that moment because they're angry that, how could you say that and be pro-choice, Yeah. And because I think and understand, I understand how she could say that and be pro-choice, because for some people, like Oprah, they look at their parents' decision and they're thankful. They say, thank you for choosing me when you didn't have to, but they think, well, I don't want someone else to have to go through that suffering. And then other people like me, they think, who has the right to take away someone's life, like Oprah, like me, because of these societal ills?
But do you think at the minimum, forgive me, but do you think at the minimum, I love that you keep on saying image bearers of God, children of God is another way to say it, but do you think at the minimum we can at least not try to shame these women?
Oh my gosh, of course. I mean, shame, of course.
I'm not saying that you would, but I think
absolutely.
And Nick, that reflects a political mantra that's what evangelicals or pro-life people want to do. Now, we're running out of time, so I have to interject a little bit.
Please.
This has been delightful because we could go on for hours.
Yes.
And which means it's successful, in my estimation. That we've mixed pro-life and pro-Christian Muslim healthy relations together.
I would think that being pro-life would mean that you would be pro-Christian Muslim relations.
Well, I think that's a good point to make. I think it's the image bearer of God in all people.
Absolutely.
Let me, which brings us to the deeper point, is that in the debate over abortion or Islam or any other debate, I have one criterion by which I judge what argument I'm going to find more persuasive. And that is, are they willing to be accountable to people who disagree with them civilly when they do so, okay? And in the debate of abortion, I've done debates in all the Ivy Leagues well beyond this issue. The vast majority of the political and financial abortion world does not want to talk about it.
No, they will. I mean, unfortunately, I've approached different people, even in Connecticut, local leaders, and they will not even talk to you. They won't even look at you. They'll protest outside of your center, and then when you go to talk to them, they don't want to hear it. I mean, we had that happen with NARAL Pro-Choice Connecticut, where, first of all, it was a group of all white older women, and they came outside of our center with their signs, abortion rights, blah, blah, blah. Our clients came out to support us, and they are Black and Hispanic and everything. They're holding signs saying, we love ABC, and then these women are chanting in the corner. So I go over to them and I say, you are here to protect these women, our clients, from people like us. Why don't you go and talk to them? Why don't you have a conversation with them? But they didn't want to have a conversation with them.
I've got
They
to
wanted
interrupt you because our time is running out, and I am charged with watching the clock. But let me just make one final observation, and then we'll wrap it up. In my rewrite of the Connecticut Constitution, I've also done the same thing with the federal Constitution. I reduced it from, as of 2006, when I did it, from 48,000 pages down to 24. And there's 1,000 reasons why I think this is good and we have to pursue it. But in both cases, they are based on a political articulation of 6 theological ethics I have. And I just want to see if we all agree with them. I think we do. And this is what my mission is. If we can get these ethics to be affirmed as the same as loving God and loving neighbor, that's my mission. So number 1 is the power to give. God gives, and so we should give to others. Okay. Number 2, the power to live in the light, transparency, not hiddenness. 3, and this comes to this debate, the power of informed choice. Define what is life and death, what is freedom, what is slavery, what is good, what is evil. And when you define terms, people truly have informed choice. And that's utterly necessary politically. Number 4 is the power to love hard questions. All questions are on the table. If you truly respect someone as your equal, made in the image of God. From the intellectual to the emotional, the painful, and one thing I love about my Jewish friends, and I have a little part Jewish in me as well, is they love to ask the hardest questions of each other, and they hug each other afterward. I think that is just darn healthy. Number 5 is the power to love enemies. That's the Sermon on the Mount. That is the quintessence of what the gospel is all about. And then number 6, which is actually harder than loving enemies, is the power to forgive. Okay? Because usually in loving enemies is people on the other side of a barricade. Okay? Forgiving is usually someone who's been very close to you and really has hurt you very deeply. So any final, we only have a minute and 27 seconds, but any final comments on what we've talked about today or my final observations? Josh?
I think informed choice is really important. I know when I was in school and college, the first time I saw what a baby really looked like in the womb as a small, real baby, I think that's really important. And I think communicating, whether it's with Muslims and Christians or whether it's with pro-choice or pro-life, it's the communication part. And if everybody's open to that, we'll make better decisions. And we'll love each other more.
Yep. And you can love best those you listen to, and you embrace their humanity. And I've seen this more often when I've not been in many places of conflict. I've been in a few places. Well, I've been in front of the abortion centers for many years, and there's a lot of conflict there. But the point was when you listen to people, and you can just see the fear, the hate melt away. And I think that's worth it. Well, anyhow, so Josh and Christina and Nick, thank you each.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
And for those of you listening here on SCTV, thank you for joining us for our second episode of the BibleandPolitics.org. So if you go to the BibleandPolitics.org, you will see the description of the show, which we will continue, again, bringing in the widest variety of guests. Thank you. God bless.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.